Welcome to Nachtmeier Witness. Some nights feel wrong before anything happens. The air feels heavy, the room feels colder, and somewhere in the dark, you get the strange feeling that you are being watched. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who became witnesses to things they never expected to see. Some saw someone standing in the shadows. Some heard voices with no one nearby. Others found themselves in places that did not feel real at all. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a slow, dark atmosphere, subscribe to Nachtmeier Witness. Get comfortable. The night has already begun. This happened when I was around 12 years old. It was not the kind of experience where something jumped out at us or chased us through the woods. There was no ghost, strange creature, or person hiding nearby as far as we knew. Even so, it remains one of the most disturbing things I have ever seen. At that age, my friends and I spent a lot of time outside. We lived near a creek that ran through a quiet area away from the main roads. During wetter parts of the year, the water could move quickly and cover most of the creek bed. But when the weather had been dry for a while, the creek became very shallow. That was how it looked on the day this happened. Most of the water had disappeared, leaving only a small stream running through the middle. It was several feet wide in some places, but probably no deeper than 4 inches. In other places, the water was even shallower. You could easily step across it or walk beside it without getting more than the bottoms of your shoes wet. The rest of the creek bed was covered in mud, stones, dry branches, and patches of sand. There were steep banks on both sides in some areas, with trees and bushes growing above them. The bends in the creek made it impossible to see very far ahead. To us, it felt like a place to explore. We were children, and walking along an almost dry creek seemed like an adventure. We could follow it around corners, climb over fallen branches, look for frogs or insects, and pretend we were traveling somewhere nobody else had been. We did not have any serious plan that day. We were not searching for anything. We were simply walking and talking. There were several of us, although I do not remember the exact number now. We moved along the creek slowly, stepping around puddles and trying not to sink into the softer parts of the mud. The day felt normal. I remember the sound of our shoes scraping against stones and the quiet movement of the water beside us. Birds made noise in the trees, and insects moved near the surface of the creek. Every now and then, one of us would find something interesting. It might be an unusual rock, an old bottle, or the tracks of an animal that had come down to drink. Places like that collect all kinds of rubbish. People throw things from bridges or leave bags near the water, and storms carry objects from one area to another. Finding something strange in a creek was not unusual. That was why we did not become worried immediately when we noticed the smell. At first, it was faint. It was only a bad smell carried toward us by the air. We stopped talking for a moment, and someone asked if the others could smell it too. We could. It smelled rotten. There are different kinds of bad smells. Mud has a smell, stagnant water has a smell, rubbish left in the heat has a smell, dead animals have a smell too. At 12 years old, I could not immediately identify exactly what it was, but I knew it was worse than ordinary dirty water. Someone made a joke about a dead fish. That seemed possible. The creek had dried up, and fish could have become trapped in a shallow pool. Maybe several had died when the water disappeared. We continued walking. As we moved around the bend, the smell became stronger. It was thick enough that we started breathing through our mouths. One of my friends covered their nose with a shirt. Another complained that we should turn around. Still, curiosity kept us moving. Children often continue towards something unpleasant because they want to know what caused it. We had already come that far, and whatever was producing the smell seemed to be just beyond the next bend. We expected to find a dead deer, a pile of rubbish, or maybe the body of a farm animal. The creek turned again. That was when we saw the dogs. There were not one or two of them. There were somewhere between 8 and 12 bodies lying around the creek bed and near the banks. I cannot remember the exact number, because we did not stand there and count carefully. There were simply too many. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. My mind struggled to understand what I was seeing. At first, the shapes looked like piles of dirty fur and rubbish. Then, I began noticing legs, paws, tails, and faces. They were all dogs. Some were large, some were small. They were different breeds, different colors, and different ages. A few looked like they might once have been pets. Others may have been strays, but there was no way to know. They were lying in different positions, scattered close enough together that it was obvious they had not all died there naturally. The smell was almost impossible to handle. It was much stronger now that we were close. It seemed to fill my nose, mouth, and throat. Even when I tried not to breathe, I could taste it. Flies covered the bodies. The buzzing was constant. Some of the dogs had been dead longer than others. Their bodies were in different stages of decomposition. A few still looked clearly like dogs from a distance. Others were swollen, damaged, or partly broken down. Maggots moved through the fur and wounds. The sight made my stomach turn. One of my friends stepped back and nearly fell into the water. Another began gagging. We should have left immediately. Instead, we stood there staring. I think part of us was trying to understand whether what we were seeing was real. Nothing in our normal lives had prepared us for a scene like that. We had seen dead animals before. Most children who spend time outdoors eventually find a dead bird, rabbit, or squirrel. Sometimes animals are hit by cars or killed by other animals. This was completely different. There were too many bodies. They were too close together, and once we looked more carefully, it became clear that these dogs had not died by accident. We moved closer, although we stayed several feet away. I wish we had not investigated. I wish we had turned around as soon as we saw them. But we were young, shocked, and trying to find an explanation. Maybe someone had dumped the bodies there after the dogs died from an illness. Maybe they had been killed by a vehicle. Maybe there had been a dog fight. Those explanations disappeared when we saw the injuries. Several dogs had broken bones in places that did not look natural. Some had damaged legs and ribs. Others had skulls that appeared crushed or caved in. The injuries were not all the same, but many of them seemed to have been caused by heavy blows. It looked as though someone had beaten them. The more we examined the scene from a distance, the worse it became. Some of the bodies appeared to show repeated injuries, not one quick strike. It did not look like someone had killed them all in one accident. It looked deliberate. It looked violent. It looked as though someone had hurt them before leaving them there. At 12 years old, I did not understand every detail, but I understood cruelty. I knew a person had probably done this. That realization frightened me more than the bodies themselves. A wild animal kills because it is hungry or defending itself. A car can kill accidentally. Illness can kill without anyone choosing it. But someone had apparently collected different dogs and beaten them to death. We began looking around the creek. The trees and bushes suddenly felt less harmless. Before finding the dogs, the bends in the creek had made the walk feel exciting. Now every corner and shadow felt like a place where someone could be watching. We had no idea when the dogs had been left there. Most had clearly been dead for some time, but that did not mean the person responsible was far away. They could have lived nearby. They could have used the creek because it was hidden from the road. They could have returned regularly. One of us said that we needed to leave. Nobody argued. We backed away from the bodies, trying not to step into the shallow water or slip on the mud. For a moment, I was afraid one of the dogs might suddenly move, even though I knew they were dead. My mind kept creating terrible possibilities. What if one was still alive? What if we heard it breathing? What if the person who had killed them came around the bend? We turned and began walking back the way we had come. At first, we moved quickly. Then, the fear became stronger, and we started running. Running through a dry creek bed is difficult. Stones rolled beneath our shoes, branches caught at our legs, and muddy areas made us slide. Still, none of us wanted to slow down. The smell followed us for longer than I expected. Even after we had gone around one bend, I could still smell it. After the next bend, it was weaker, but it remained in my nose. I felt as though it had soaked into my clothes and hair. Nobody joked anymore. On the way toward the dogs, we had been loud, laughing and talking over one another. On the way back, we barely spoke. Every sound behind us made me look over my shoulder. I expected to see someone following us. I imagined an adult standing in the creek bed carrying a bat, hammer, or heavy piece of wood. I imagined that person had watched us discover the bodies and now wanted to stop us from telling anyone. Nothing appeared. We eventually left the creek and returned to an area that felt safer. Cars, houses, and other people were nearby. The ordinary world had not changed, but I felt different. Only a short distance away, hidden around several bends in the creek, there was a pile of dead dogs. People walked, drove, and lived near the area without knowing. That disturbed me. Something terrible could exist close to normal life and remain completely unseen. I do not remember exactly who we told first. We may have told our parents or another adult. The memory of the discovery is much clearer than what happened afterward. I do remember trying to describe the dogs and feeling that the words were not enough. Saying there were dead dogs in the creek did not explain the scene. It did not explain the number of bodies, the different stages of decay, the crushed skulls, the broken bones, the flies, or the smell. It also did not explain the question that frightened all of us. Who had done it? The dogs were all different. That meant they probably had not come from one accidental event. They did not look like a single litter or a group that had died together naturally. Some were large enough to be adult dogs. Others seemed younger. Some had long fur, others had short fur. They may have come from different homes and different parts of the area. I began wondering whether they had been stolen pets. Were families looking for them? Had children gone to bed wondering why their dog never came home? Did someone put up missing posters while the dog's body was lying in the creek? That thought stayed with me. When a dog disappears, people often imagine that it ran away or was taken in by another family. They keep hoping it will return. I wondered how many owners still had that hope. I also wondered whether the person responsible had chosen those dogs randomly. Maybe they found strays. Maybe they stole them from gardens. Maybe they offered to take unwanted animals and then brought them to the creek. There were many possibilities, and none of them were good. The injuries suggested anger, but the number of animals suggested planning. One violent act could happen during a moment of rage. 8, 10, or 12 dead dogs suggested something repeated. The person had done it more than once, or they had killed several animals together. That was what made the place feel like, more than a dumping area. It felt like evidence of someone who enjoyed cruelty. For several nights after the discovery, I had trouble sleeping. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw the creek again. I saw the dogs lying in the mud. I saw damaged heads and twisted legs. I heard flies buzzing. Most of all, I remembered the smell. Smell is powerful. It can return years later without warning. Sometimes rubbish, spoiled meat, or a dead animal near the road reminds me of that day. For a second, I am 12 again, walking around the bend. I also became more protective of animals after that. Whenever I saw a loose dog, I worried about where it might go. If I saw someone treating an animal badly, I wondered whether their behavior could become worse when nobody was watching. Before that day, I knew people could hurt animals. I had heard stories and seen reports on television, but those things felt distant. The creek made it real. A person in or near our community had apparently beaten multiple dogs and thrown their bodies away like rubbish. They may have looked completely normal in daily life. They could have had a job, neighbors, or a family. They could have walked past us in a shop. The idea that cruelty could hide inside an ordinary person was difficult to accept. For a while, my friends and I avoided the creek. None of us wanted to return and find the dogs still there. We also did not want to discover anything worse. The place that had once felt like an adventure now felt polluted by what we had seen. Even if the bodies were removed, I knew I would remember where they had been. Every bend would remind me of the smell getting stronger. Every pile of leaves or dark object would make me think of fur and bones. I sometimes wondered whether the creek had been chosen because children used it. Maybe the person did not know we played there, or maybe they did not care who found the bodies. That possibility was disturbing too. Someone could have placed them near a road or called animal control. Instead, they had taken them to a hidden part of the creek. It seemed like an attempt to make the dogs disappear. The water might have carried some of the evidence away if the creek had risen again. Animals and insects would eventually remove more. The person may have believed nobody would find them. But we did. We were only children, wandering through the shallow water because we were bored. I still wonder what happened after adults became involved. Were the dogs examined? Did anyone report the scene to the police? Was the person responsible ever identified? I never heard of anyone being arrested. Maybe there was an explanation we did not understand. Perhaps the dogs had been put down elsewhere and dumped illegally. Maybe some of the damage happened after death because of animals, water, or the movement of the bodies. I have considered those possibilities as I became older. But at the time, the injuries looked deliberate. The broken bones and crushed skulls did not look like normal decay. They looked like the result of repeated blows. All of us came to the same conclusion without needing to say much. Someone had beaten those dogs. The uncertainty is part of why the memory has stayed with me. There was no ending. We did not see the person responsible. We did not learn why they did it. We did not know whether they stopped. For all we knew, more dogs could have disappeared after that. Sometimes people describe unsettling moments as things that felt unreal. This did not feel unreal. It felt too real. The bodies were physical. The smell was physical. The flies and maggots were there. The bones were broken. Nothing supernatural needed to happen. The scene was horrifying because a human being may have created it. I remember one of the smaller dogs most clearly. I do not remember its exact breed or color anymore. I only remember thinking that it looked young. That detail made me feel especially sick. A young dog would probably have trusted people. If someone called to it or offered food, it might have approached without fear. I wondered whether that was how the person caught it. I wondered if the dogs had known what was happening to the others. I tried not to think about those questions, but children do not always know how to stop their minds from going to the worst places. We had described the day as a freak show moment because that was the only language we had. It looked like a scene from a horror film, except there was no camera crew, fake blood, or person waiting to shout that it was over. These had been living animals. Someone may have loved them. Then they became damaged bodies left beside a dying stream. The contrast stayed with me. It had been an ordinary day. The sky looked normal. The water moved quietly. We were joking and exploring. Only the smell warned us that something was wrong. Then we went around a bend, and childhood became slightly less safe than it had been before. Until then, I believed that the worst things usually happened far away or in stories told by adults. That day taught me that terrible things could be hidden only a short walk from home. They could sit beneath trees and beside shallow water while the rest of the world continued as normal. The experience was not the most dramatic thing that has ever happened to me. Nobody chased us. We were not physically harmed. We managed to leave without seeing whoever had put the dogs there. But it was deeply unsettling. It showed me evidence of cruelty without giving me any explanation for it. Even now, I sometimes imagine walking back into that creek. In my mind, the water is still low. The stones still move beneath my shoes. My friends are still laughing as we follow the stream. Then, the rotten smell reaches us. We could turn around at that moment. We could decide we do not need to know what is around the next bend. But in the memory, we always keep walking. The smell becomes stronger. The creek turns, and the dogs are still there. This happened when I was in high school, sometime around 2009. I have only told the story a few times since then because I know how ridiculous it sounds. Even now, I do not have a good explanation for what my friends and I heard that night. At the time, I had a best friend I spent almost every day with. We were the kind of friends who could turn a completely normal day into some kind of adventure, even if we were doing nothing important. One morning, we decided to skip school. I cannot remember exactly why we did it. There was no big plan, and we were not trying to go anywhere exciting. We were teenagers and probably just did not feel like sitting through classes that day. Somehow, we managed to avoid going to school and ended up spending most of the day in front of a computer. This was before smartphones were as common as they are now, so when we wanted to waste time online, we usually sat together at a desktop computer and searched for random things. For some reason, we became interested in scary stories. It started with reading a few supposedly true paranormal experiences. Then we began searching for videos of people who claimed they had seen ghosts, demons, or even the devil. The internet was full of low-quality videos with dark images, strange noises, and dramatic titles claiming the footage was real. Most of it was obviously fake, but that did not stop us from watching. We searched for stories about people who had made deals with the devil. We found videos of supposed possessions, haunted houses, shadow figures, strange voices, and creatures caught on camera. Whenever we found something frightening, we showed it to each other and tried to decide whether it looked real. Sometimes we laughed at how badly made the videos were. In others, there would be a dark figure standing in the background or a strange face appearing in a window. Even when we knew the footage was probably edited, some of it still made us uncomfortable. We kept watching anyway. The more videos we saw, the more disturbing our searches became. We went from ordinary ghost stories to people claiming they had seen demonic figures standing beside roads or appearing inside their homes. We read about people hearing voices calling their names from empty rooms. We watched videos where someone entered an abandoned building and heard laughter coming from somewhere in the darkness. By the afternoon, we had spent hours filling our heads with that kind of material. During the day, it did not feel too serious. Sunlight was coming through the windows, and we were sitting together in a familiar place. We could laugh whenever something frightened us. Still, some of the stories stayed in my mind. Every time I looked away from the computer screen, I noticed the darker corners of the room. If the house made a noise, I became more aware of it. My imagination had already started turning ordinary things into something frightening. Eventually, the day passed, and evening arrived. Later that night, my best friend and I met another friend at an elementary school playground located down the street. The school was close enough that we had all been there many times before. During the day, it was completely normal. Children played there, parents waited near the entrance, and teachers moved between the buildings. At night, the playground felt very different. The school was empty, the building was dark, and the equipment stood still under the streetlights. There were swings, slides, climbing equipment, and benches. The ground beneath some parts of the playground was covered with sand, dirt, or soft material designed to protect children if they fell. There were houses nearby, but the playground itself could become very quiet at night. My best friend and I were excited to tell our other friend about everything we had found online. We started describing the videos and stories from earlier. We told him about people who claimed to have seen the devil. We described strange figures caught on cameras and voices recorded in empty buildings. We probably made some of the stories sound even more frightening than they had been, because we enjoyed seeing his reaction. The three of us stood or sat near the playground equipment, talking in the darkness. At first, we were laughing. Our other friend made jokes about the stories and told us that most of the videos were fake. We agreed that many of them probably were, but then one of us would mention a detail that had looked real, and the conversation would become serious again. Because we had been thinking about paranormal things all day, every shadow around the playground seemed slightly more threatening. The trees moved when the wind passed through them. The school building had dark windows that reflected small amounts of light. The space beneath the playground equipment was almost completely black. Still, none of us wanted to admit we felt nervous. We were teenage boys standing together. If one of us said he was scared, the others would probably laugh at him. So we kept talking. I do not remember exactly which story we were discussing when the sound happened. One moment, all three of us were speaking. The next, we heard someone laughing. The laughter did not come from across the playground. It did not come from the school building, the road, or the houses nearby. It came from directly beneath us. The best way I can describe it is to imagine standing on top of a table while another person is underneath it, laughing upward at you. That was how close it sounded. It seemed to be coming from under the ground. The laugh was loud and clear. It lasted for only about 3 seconds, but that was enough. All three of us stopped speaking at the exact same time. Nobody asked, "Did you hear that?" We did not need to. The sound had been loud enough that we all knew the others had heard it too. For those 3 seconds, the laughter seemed to rise from the earth beneath our feet. It was not a distant voice that the wind had carried toward us. It was not a child laughing from one of the nearby houses. It did not sound like someone walking past the playground. It sounded like a person was directly below where we were standing. When the laughter stopped, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. None of us moved. We just froze. My body became tense, and I suddenly felt cold, even though I do not remember the night being especially cold. I stared at the ground. Part of me expected it to move or crack open. I imagined someone hiding inside a tunnel or hole beneath the playground. I imagined a face appearing between the equipment. The place had felt open only seconds earlier. Now it seemed as if something could be hiding underneath every dark area. One of my friends looked at me. I looked at the other. None of us laughed. No one tried to make a joke. That was how I knew the fear was real. Usually, if a strange noise happened while we were together, one of us would immediately make fun of it. Someone would blame a cat, a bird, or another person hiding nearby. This time, nobody had an explanation. The sound had been too close and too strange. We stood there for a few more seconds, listening. The laughter did not happen again. There were no footsteps. No one jumped out from behind the playground equipment. We did not see anyone running away. The school remained dark and empty. One of us eventually said that we should leave. Nobody argued. We walked away from the playground quickly. I do not think we ran immediately because none of us wanted to be the first person to panic. We tried to act calm, but we kept looking behind us. Every few steps, I expected to hear the laughter again. I thought it might follow us from beneath the ground, moving under the pavement as we walked. Nothing happened. Once we were farther from the school, we began speaking again. Each of us tried to explain what we had heard. Maybe someone had been hiding under the playground equipment. Maybe the sound came from a nearby storm drain. Maybe there was a pipe underground that carried sound from another location. Maybe someone in one of the houses had laughed, and the shape of the schoolyard made the sound seem closer. Those explanations sounded reasonable when we said them, but none of them matched what we had experienced. The laughter had sounded directly beneath us. It had not echoed from a distance. It also happened at the exact moment we were talking about demons and paranormal encounters. That timing made it much harder to ignore. If we had been discussing sports, school, or music, perhaps the sound would not have frightened us so much. We might have searched around and found an explanation. But we had spent the entire day reading about the devil and watching frightening videos. Then, at night, while retelling those stories, something laughed from below us. It felt like a response. I went home soon afterward. By the time I reached my house, I was still frightened. Usually, I tried to hide fear from my parents. I did not want them to treat me like a child, especially because I was already in high school. That night, I did not care. I woke them up and told them what had happened. I explained that my friend and I had skipped school, although that part of the story was probably not something I wanted to admit. I told them about the videos we had watched, meeting our other friend at the elementary school, and hearing laughter beneath us. My parents listened, but I do not remember exactly what they said. They probably believed there was a normal explanation. Maybe they thought another teenager had been hiding nearby and playing a prank. Maybe they believed the sound had come from an animal or from one of the houses. I wanted them to tell me exactly what it was. Instead, I still had questions. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every sound in the house reminded me of the laughter. When the building settled or the pipes moved, I wondered whether something was underneath the floor. I kept replaying those 3 seconds in my mind. The sound was not long or dramatic. It was only laughter. But there was something wrong about where it came from. The next morning, the entire experience almost felt unreal. Daylight made everything seem less frightening. I began wondering whether our imagination had affected us. We had spent hours watching paranormal videos, so maybe we were already expecting something strange to happen. But imagination could not explain why all 3 of us heard the same sound at the same moment. If only one of us had heard it, the others could have said he was mistaken. Instead, the laughter stopped all 3 of us in the middle of the conversation. We had the same reaction. We knew it was real. About a week later, we decided to return to the playground. I am not sure whether we went back because we wanted an answer or because we wanted to prove that we were not afraid. It was easier to return after several days had passed. The memory was still uncomfortable, but we had spent time discussing normal explanations. We thought we might have stepped on something. Maybe there was a hollow section beneath the playground surface. Perhaps our weight had pushed air through a pipe or caused part of the equipment to make a strange sound. We wanted to recreate it. We returned to the same area and walked around slowly. We stepped on different parts of the ground. We jumped. We pushed and shook the playground equipment. We looked underneath the slides and climbing structures. We searched for storm drains, holes, pipes, speakers, or anything else that might have produced the sound. Nothing did. The equipment squeaked and moved, but it did not sound like laughter. Our shoes made dull sounds against the ground, but nothing came from below. We even tried standing in the exact place where we believed we had heard it. There was nothing unusual there. The ground did not feel hollow. There was no opening. We listened for voices from nearby houses, but none sounded close enough to explain what we had heard. We spent quite a while trying to make the noise happen again. It never did. Eventually, we gave up. Returning during the day made the playground seem harmless again, but it did not solve anything. If the laughter had come from a person, where had they been? There was not enough space beneath the nearby equipment for someone to hide without being seen. Even if a person had been lying there, we should have heard movement when they left. We had looked around immediately after the sound. Nobody was there. If it had come from underground, I could not imagine what could laugh beneath a playground. I know there may be simple explanations. Sound can behave strangely at night. It can travel through pipes, drains, and open spaces. A person laughing far away could possibly sound closer depending on the buildings and ground. There may have been a tunnel or drainage system beneath the school that we did not know about. Maybe the noise came through it from somewhere else. An animal could also make a sound similar to human laughter. Foxes, birds, and other animals can create noises that people mistake for voices. But the sound did not remind me of an animal. It sounded human. It sounded aware. It sounded like someone found our conversation funny. The fact that we had spent the day searching for stories about the devil made the event feel almost like a punishment for what we had been doing. I am not saying we summoned anything. I do not believe watching videos on a computer can bring something supernatural into the world. Still, the coincidence has always bothered me. We skipped school. We spent hours filling our minds with stories about demons and paranormal events. That night, we repeated those stories at an empty elementary school. Then, laughter came from beneath the ground. It was exactly the kind of thing we had been watching online. If I heard the same sound today, I might react differently. I would probably use my phone to record the area. I would search for drains or contact someone who knew the layout of the school. I might stay long enough to find a clear explanation. At the time, we were teenagers, and fear took over. The moment the laugh stopped, all we wanted was to leave. I sometimes wonder whether someone had been playing a prank on us. Maybe another student knew we were at the playground and hid nearby. Maybe they used a phone or small speaker to play a recording. But portable speakers were not as common then as they are now, and we did not see anyone. Also, whoever did it would have needed to know exactly what we were discussing and choose the perfect moment to play the sound. It is possible, but I have never found evidence for it. We did not hear about anyone else having a similar experience at that playground. No one told us about underground rooms or tunnels. The event remained something only the three of us shared. As the years passed, we talked about it less. People moved on, friendships changed, and high school became a distant memory. Every now and then, I remembered the laugh and wondered what my old friends believed now. Did they decide it had been an animal? Did they still think it sounded like a person beneath the ground? Did the memory frighten them as much as it frightened me? I have only told the story a few times because I know how it sounds. Someone always asks whether we were drinking or using drugs. We were not. Others say we must have heard a fox or another animal. Maybe we did. Some people laugh and say the scary videos made us imagine it. But three people do not usually imagine the same loud sound at the same time. I do not claim that the devil was beneath the playground. I do not claim it was a ghost, demon, or supernatural being. I only know what we heard. It was a human-sounding laugh. It lasted about 3 seconds. It came from directly below us. It was loud enough to stop all three of us in the middle of our conversation. Then it was gone. We returned later and tried to recreate it. We never found anything that made the same sound. That is the entire event. Nothing followed us home. We did not see a figure in the playground. There were no strange marks on the ground, and the laughter never returned. In some ways, I think that makes it more unsettling. There was no answer and no ending. It was only a sound in the darkness, perfectly timed with our conversation, coming from a place where no person should have been. Even now, when I think about that night, I can picture the three of us standing silently at the elementary school. One moment, we were laughing about ghost stories. Then something below us laughed back. A few years ago, I decided to spend the afternoon walking through a stretch of woodland a few miles from my town. It wasn't one of the popular hiking trails with signs and benches. It was the kind of place where the paths slowly disappeared into thick trees and the sounds of traffic faded until all you could hear was the wind moving through the branches overhead. I had been there a few times before, but on that day I wandered farther than usual. I left the main trail behind and followed a narrow animal track that twisted between old trees and thick patches of undergrowth. It was one of those quiet autumn evenings when the sun hangs low in the sky and everything feels strangely still. At first, the walk was peaceful. Birds were calling somewhere in the distance, and every now and then I could hear leaves crunching beneath my boots. The deeper I went into the woods, the quieter everything became. Looking back now, that silence was probably the first thing that unsettled me, although I didn't realize it at the time. About an hour into my walk, I noticed a smell. At first it was faint, just a strange sweetness in the air. It wasn't the smell of flowers or damp earth. It was something thick and unpleasant, but at the same time, oddly sweet. I stopped walking and sniffed the air, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The smell grew stronger with every step. I've always been a curious person, and instead of turning around and leaving, I started following it. The scent seemed to be coming from somewhere off to my left, beyond a wall of bushes and tangled branches. Part of me knew that I should probably ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed through the undergrowth, moving branches out of the way as the smell became almost unbearable. Within seconds, I regretted my decision. Hidden beneath the trees, lying on the ground only a few feet away from me, was a body. For a moment, my brain simply refused to understand what I was looking at. I stood there, frozen, staring at something that didn't seem real. Then the details slowly started to sink in. The man had obviously been dead for a while. His body was swollen and badly discolored. Parts of his skin had turned dark green and black. Animals had clearly been feeding on him, and there were insects everywhere. The smell that had drawn me there was overwhelming up close, so strong that I had to turn away and fight the urge to throw up. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a tree root. Even now, years later, I can still picture exactly what I saw that day. Certain images never really leave you. For several minutes, I just stood there in complete shock. My mind raced through 100 different explanations. Maybe someone had been murdered. Maybe there had been an accident. Maybe he had gotten lost. Eventually, I forced myself to take out my phone and call the police. Trying to explain my location was difficult because I was so far from any road. The operator asked me question after question while I stared at the body, trying not to look directly at it. "Are you sure he's dead?" "Yes. Can you tell if he's injured?" "I don't know." "Stay where you are. Officers are on their way." I remember asking if I could go back to the main trail and wait there, but they told me to stay nearby so I could guide the officers to the location when they arrived. That was the moment when I realized I was going to be sitting in the middle of nowhere beside a dead man for quite a long time. At first, I kept my distance. I sat on a fallen tree a few yards away and tried to distract myself by looking at my phone, but there was almost no signal. Every few minutes, I would glance back toward the body just to reassure myself that this nightmare was actually happening. The woods felt different after that discovery. The sounds that had seemed peaceful earlier suddenly became unsettling. Every crack of a branch made me jump. Every movement in the bushes made my heart race. As the sun began to disappear behind the trees, darkness settled over the forest much faster than I expected. The temperature dropped, and the shadows around me grew longer and darker. Before long, the only light came from my phone screen and the faint glow of the evening sky above the treetops. I was alone. Completely alone. Well, not completely. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing toward the shape lying in the darkness. The strangest thing about death is how quickly your imagination takes control. Rationally, I knew that the man couldn't hurt me. He was gone. Whatever had happened to him was over. But sitting there in the dark, miles away from anyone else, my mind kept playing tricks on me. Sometimes I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Sometimes I convinced myself that his position had changed. Once, I could have sworn that one of his arms was in a different place than before. I stared at it for nearly 10 minutes before realizing that I was only remembering it incorrectly. The waiting felt endless. The smell lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of wet leaves and damp earth. The silence pressed down on me from every direction. I started wondering who he had been. Did he have a family? Had anyone reported him missing? Had somebody been searching for him all this time? Or had nobody even noticed that he was gone? Eventually, after what felt like hours, I saw flashlights moving through the trees. I've never felt relief like that in my life. The police officers arrived with paramedics, and soon the quiet forest was filled with voices and bright lights. They asked me questions, took my statement, and examined the area around the body. One officer eventually pulled me aside and thanked me for staying. I asked if they knew what had happened. At first, they couldn't say much, but later I learned the truth. The man had taken his own life. Apparently, he had disappeared weeks earlier. He had chosen that isolated spot deep in the woods because he didn't want anyone to find him. For some reason, that detail stayed with me. He had gone out there to be alone forever, and by complete accident, I had disturbed the place where he had chosen to die. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I replayed the discovery over and over in my head. The smell, the darkness, the silence, the endless wait beside the body. Every night, pieces of those memories returned when I tried to sleep. Then, the dreams started. At first, they were simple nightmares. I would be walking through the woods again, following that strange, sweet smell. No matter which direction I turned, it always led me back to the same place. Back to the body. But after a while, the dreams changed. In the dreams, the man wasn't dead anymore. He would sit up slowly and look directly at me. The first time it happened, I woke up screaming. After that, the dreams became more vivid. Sometimes I would find him standing between the trees, watching me from a distance. Sometimes he would appear behind me without making a sound. But the worst dreams were the ones where he spoke. He was always angry. In those nightmares, he blamed me for disturbing him. He told me that I should have left him alone. He said I had no right to find him. The things he whispered were horrible. Again and again, he would tell me that I should join him, that I should stay in the woods forever, that I should do what he had done. I know, logically, that these dreams were almost certainly my brain trying to process something traumatic. Discovering a dead body isn't something most people ever experience, and seeing someone in that condition leaves scars that aren't always visible. But knowing that didn't make the nightmares any easier. For months, I dreaded going to sleep. Every night I worried that I would see him again. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night convinced that someone was standing beside my bed. Sometimes I could still smell that sickly sweet odor, even though I knew it wasn't real. Friends told me that the dreams would eventually stop. For the most part, they were right. As the years passed, they became less frequent. Life moved on. The images faded a little, and I stopped thinking about that evening every single day. But they never disappeared completely. Even now, years later, he still appears from time to time. Usually, it's after something reminds me of that day. A documentary about missing people. A walk through the woods. The smell of wet leaves after rain. Or, like tonight, simply talking about what happened. Sometimes the dream is exactly the same. I'm back in those woods, following that strange sweetness through the trees. The light is fading, and the silence feels wrong. I push aside the branches. He's there, exactly where I found him all those years ago. Then his eyes open. And every single time, just before I wake up, he says the same thing. You should have left me alone. Of course, I know it's only a dream. I know it's just my mind replaying one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. At least, that's what I tell myself whenever I wake up in the dark. But every now and then, usually in the quiet moments before sleep, I can't help remembering the feeling of sitting alone in that forest for hours, beside someone who had died there, surrounded by darkness and silence. And on those nights, no matter how much I try to convince myself otherwise, a small part of me still wonders whether something followed me out of those woods. Before the next witness tells their story, take a moment to subscribe to Nachtmayer Witness. This channel is for the late hours, when sleep is close, but the mind is still awake enough to notice every sound in the room. New true stories arrive here for anyone drawn to strange encounters, uneasy memories, and nights that never felt normal again. Leave a like if the stories have pulled you in so far. Now, let's return to the darkness. About 2 years ago, I made what should have been a simple drive home after a family reunion. The whole trip was supposed to take around 2 hours, and at the beginning of the night, I wasn't worried about it at all. Everyone had offered me a place to stay, but I had work early the next morning and didn't want to deal with the rush of getting ready at dawn and driving back half asleep. Ironically, that decision almost put me in a situation I'll never forget. It was late when I finally left. Most of my relatives were still sitting around the backyard, talking and laughing under the porch lights as I walked to my car. My aunt asked me one last time if I was sure I didn't want to spend the night. "I'll be fine," I told her. "It's only a couple of hours." She shook her head and laughed. "Don't fall asleep behind the wheel." At the time, it was just a joke. The first half hour of the drive was easy. I turned on the radio, rolled the window down slightly, and enjoyed the cool night air. The roads were mostly empty, apart from the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. The farther I got from town, the darker everything became. Most of the route cut through the countryside. Dense woods lined both sides of the road for miles, with thick bushes growing right up to the edge of the pavement. During the day, it was actually a beautiful drive. But at night, it felt completely different. The trees seemed to swallow the headlights. Every now and then, I would pass an old farmhouse, sitting in darkness. But for the most part, there was nothing except endless stretches of road disappearing into the blackness ahead. About 45 minutes into the drive, exhaustion hit me like a truck. It wasn't the normal kind of tiredness that creeps up slowly. One minute I felt completely awake, and the next it felt like someone had flipped a switch in my brain. My eyes suddenly became heavy, and I had to blink several times just to stay focused on the road. I turned the radio up. I rolled the windows down farther. I even slapped my own face a few times, hoping the cold air would wake me up. Nothing worked. I started looking for somewhere safe to stop. A gas station, a parking lot, literally anything. But there was nothing. just miles of empty road and endless forest. I knew I shouldn't keep driving in that condition. I'd heard too many stories about people falling asleep at the wheel for just a few seconds and never waking up again. Eventually, I made a decision that still feels stupid when I think about it. I spotted a small gap between some bushes on the side of the road and slowly pulled onto the grass. It wasn't really a parking spot. It was more like a narrow patch of land, hidden behind a wall of trees and bushes. From the road, my car was mostly concealed. I remember glancing at the clock, 11:22 p.m. I told myself I would close my eyes for 20 minutes, maybe half an hour at most. I leaned the seat back, locked the doors, and fell asleep almost instantly. I don't know how long I had been sleeping when I heard the sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. At first, I wasn't even sure if I was awake. The noise was soft, almost gentle, like somebody dragging their fingernails across metal. My eyes slowly opened, and for a few seconds I couldn't remember where I was. Then I looked at the clock. 11:50 p.m. The scratching stopped almost immediately. Still half asleep, I sat there listening, waiting for it to start again. The silence that followed was so complete that I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it had been a branch rubbing against the car. Maybe it was a raccoon or some other animal wandering through the bushes. Whatever it was, I was too exhausted to care. I adjusted my seat, closed my eyes, and drifted back to sleep. The second time was different. The sound ripped me out of sleep so suddenly that I almost jumped out of my seat. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Only this time, it didn't stop. I opened my eyes and immediately looked at the dashboard. 12:40 a.m. For a few seconds, I sat completely still. The scratching continued somewhere behind me, slow and deliberate. My heart started beating faster. Again, I tried to tell myself it was just an animal. Maybe a fox had climbed onto the back of the car. Maybe some tree branches had shifted in the wind. But one thought kept bothering me. Why had it come back? Almost an hour had passed since the first time I'd heard the noise. The woods outside were completely still. There wasn't even any wind. I carefully looked into the rearview mirror. At first, I couldn't see anything except darkness. Then, just for a split second, my headlights caught movement. Something or someone was running away from my car and disappearing into the trees. I only saw it for an instant, but it was definitely human. Every horror story I'd ever heard suddenly rushed into my head. My mind immediately jumped to those old urban legends about killers waiting on deserted roads, scratching on windows to lure people outside. I remember whispering, "Nope, absolutely not." Without thinking twice, I shoved the key into the ignition and started the engine. The car roared to life, and I slammed my foot onto the gas pedal. I wasn't interested in finding out who had been outside my car. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. The road ahead curved sharply to the right about 100 yards away. My headlights swept across the trees as I accelerated toward it. As I came around the bend, I immediately hit the brakes. There was another car parked on the shoulder. The driver's door was wide open. For a moment, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The car was completely dark, sitting at an awkward angle on the side of the road as if somebody had pulled over in a hurry. There were no hazard lights, no movement, nothing. Against my better judgment, I slowed down. I leaned forward, trying to see if anyone was inside. The driver's seat was empty. The passenger seat was empty. The back seats looked empty too. For a second, I actually considered stopping to see if somebody needed help. Then, I remembered the scratching. I remembered the figure running into the woods. And something about the entire scene felt wrong. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Nothing. The road behind me was empty. I looked back toward the abandoned car. Still nothing. Then, out of nowhere, movement exploded from the darkness. a man came sprinting around the bend behind me. I've never seen anyone run that fast in my life. He burst out of the darkness, waving his arms wildly and screaming at the top of his lungs. "Hey!" I froze. "Hey, you!" He was getting closer. "Get out of your car!" His voice echoed through the trees. "Get the hell out of your car! Right now!" Every instinct in my body told me exactly one thing. Leave. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to ask questions. I pressed the gas pedal all the way to the floor and sped away as fast as I could. In my mirror, I could still see the man standing in the middle of the road, yelling and waving his arms, but within seconds he disappeared into the darkness behind me. For the next 20 minutes I drove in complete silence. The radio was still playing, but I couldn't hear it over the sound of my own heartbeat. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting headlights to appear behind me at any moment. Nothing. No cars. No flashing lights. No angry driver chasing me. Just darkness. By the time I reached the highway, I had convinced myself that there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe the man owned the parked car and had simply broken down. Maybe he'd been wandering through the woods looking for help. Maybe he had seen me parked farther down the road and thought I could give him a ride. But then another thought crossed my mind. If he genuinely needed help, why was he hiding in the woods behind my car? And why had someone or something been scratching at my vehicle for almost an hour? The more I thought about it, the less sense the entire situation made. When I finally got home, it was almost 3 a.m. I locked every door in my apartment and sat awake in bed for another hour, replaying the whole night in my head. For days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told a few friends, and everyone had a different theory. One friend thought the man had been trying to rob me. Another thought it might have been some kind of prank. Someone else suggested that maybe I'd scared a stranded driver who had been trying to get my attention. But nobody could explain the scratching. Nobody could explain why the figure I saw ran into the woods when I looked in the mirror. And nobody could explain why a man would scream at a stranger to get out of their car in the middle of nowhere, just after midnight. Even now, 2 years later, I still think about that night whenever I drive down isolated roads. Sometimes, when I'm driving home late and exhaustion starts creeping in, I remember waking up to that sound outside my car. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted. Maybe he was harmless. Maybe he was desperate. Or maybe leaving without finding out was the smartest decision I've ever made. What I do know is this. If you're driving alone late at night and you start getting tired, don't do what I did. Don't pull off onto some deserted road and fall asleep behind a wall of trees. Because sometimes, in places where nobody can see you and nobody can hear you, the thing that wakes you up in the middle of the night is a lot worse than your own imagination. It happened when I was very young, probably around 6 years old. My younger brother couldn't have been older than 4. Most of my memories from that age are blurry, but for some reason, that afternoon has stayed with me for years. Even now, I can still picture every detail. We lived in a quiet area, far enough away from the main road that people didn't just accidentally drive onto our property. Our driveway was long and partially hidden by trees, curving away from the road before finally opening up in front of the house. If you didn't already know we lived there, you probably wouldn't even notice the driveway as you passed. That was one of the reasons my parents liked the place. It felt private and safe. Back then, my brother and I spent almost every winter day outside. It had snowed heavily the night before, and the entire yard was covered in a thick blanket of white. The trees looked like they had been dipped in ice, and our boots left deep tracks everywhere we walked. That afternoon, we had been outside for hours. We were building little snow forts, throwing snowballs at each other, and making giant piles of snow near the edge of the driveway. Our parents were inside, probably cleaning or making lunch, while my brother and I ran around without a care in the world. I remember that everything was unusually quiet. Snow has a strange way of absorbing sound. Even though we were laughing and shouting, the world around us felt calm and still. The only noises came from our boots crunching against the ice and the occasional gust of wind blowing through the trees. Then we heard a car. At first, neither of us paid much attention. Cars sometimes passed on the road in the distance, but nobody ever drove up our driveway, unless they were family, friends, or someone who had business with my parents. When I looked up, I saw a white car slowly turning into the entrance. Even as a child, I knew that something was strange about it. The car wasn't moving quickly. It crept up the driveway at an almost uncomfortable speed, as if the driver was searching for something. My brother stopped playing and looked at me. "Who's that?" he asked. I shrugged. I don't know. At that age, seeing an unfamiliar car wasn't automatically frightening. If anything, I thought maybe it was somebody coming to visit. The car continued forward until it was only a short distance away from us. Then it stopped. I remember standing there in the snow, trying to see through the windshield, but the sunlight reflected off the glass, making it impossible to see inside. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the driver's window rolled down. The man inside looked like he was somewhere in his 30s or 40s. He had short hair and a dark goatee. He wasn't smiling. What happened next took only a few seconds, but it's the part that has stayed with me all these years. Without saying a word, the man lifted a camera. Not a phone, this was before everyone carried cameras in their pockets. It was an actual camera. He pointed it directly at us. For a moment, my brother and I simply stared back, confused. Then there was a click. He had taken our picture. I remember glancing at my brother, expecting him to say something, but he looked just as confused as I felt. The man never introduced himself. He never waved. He never asked our names or said why he was there. He simply lowered the camera, rolled the window back up, and drove away. That's it. Within seconds, the white car disappeared back down the driveway and out of sight. My brother and I stood there in silence for a moment, trying to understand what had just happened. As kids, we didn't immediately realize how strange the whole thing was. Honestly, our first reaction was curiosity more than fear. "Who was that?" my brother asked again. "I don't know. Why did he take our picture?" I had no answer. Eventually, we ran inside and told our mom. At first, she didn't seem to understand what we were saying. "A man took your picture?" "Yeah, what man?" "The guy in the white car." I still remember the expression on her face changing almost instantly. She walked to the front window and looked outside, but by then the car was gone. She started asking questions faster than we could answer them. "What did he look like? Did he say anything? Did you recognize him? Did he stop for long?" Of course, we couldn't give her many details. We were children. All we knew was that a stranger had driven onto our hidden property, rolled down his window, taken our picture, and left without saying a single word. The more my mom thought about it, the more upset she became. I remember her walking from window to window, checking outside and looking down the driveway as if she expected the car to return. She called my dad, who wasn't home at the time, and repeated the story several times. Even though I couldn't hear his side of the conversation, I could tell from my mom's voice that she was genuinely frightened. For the rest of the day, she barely let us out of her sight. As children, we didn't fully understand why she was so worried. To us, it was simply a weird thing that had happened. But as I got older, I started thinking about that day differently. Why had the man driven up our driveway in the first place? Our house wasn't visible from the road. He couldn't have accidentally ended up there. And if he was looking for someone, why didn't he get out and ask for directions? Why stop only long enough to photograph two small children playing in the snow? The older I get, the stranger the entire situation feels. Over the years, I've tried to come up with explanations. Maybe he was a surveyor, documenting houses in the area. Maybe he was lost and had mistaken our property for somewhere else. Maybe he was a photographer who thought the snowy scene looked beautiful. But none of those explanations make complete sense. If he simply liked the scenery, why photograph us instead of the house or the landscape? And why leave so quickly without saying a word? What's unsettling is that there was never any closure. Nobody ever came back. No missing posters appeared in town. No neighbor mentioned seeing the car. The strange man in the white car simply entered our lives for less than a minute and then disappeared forever. Years passed, and eventually my brother and I stopped talking about it. But every now and then, usually during winter, one of us will bring it up. Do you remember that guy who took our picture? And every single time, the conversation ends the same way. We sit there trying to fill in the gaps, trying to figure out who he was and what he wanted, knowing that we'll probably never know the answer. The memory feels even stranger now, because so much of childhood disappears with time. Faces fade, places change, and entire years become difficult to remember. But somehow, I can still see that white car pulling slowly up the driveway. I can still hear the crunch of snow beneath my boots. I can still picture the driver's window rolling down and the man silently raising his camera toward us. Then the click. The sound lasted less than a second, but the questions that came after it have lasted a lifetime. Maybe it was completely innocent. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation that none of us ever considered. Or maybe my mother's fear that day came from the same realization that still bothers me now. A stranger somehow found our hidden driveway, photographed two small children without permission, and vanished before anyone could ask why. And after all these years, that's still the part that keeps the memory from fading away. When I was really young, my parents had a weekend rule that, looking back, was probably every kid's dream. My older sister was an incredibly light sleeper. The smallest noise would wake her up, and once she was awake, nobody in the house got any peace. I, on the other hand, loved staying up late. So on Friday and Saturday nights, my parents would let me sleep in the living room. I could stay awake watching television for as long as I wanted, and everyone else could sleep in silence. At the time, it felt like freedom. We lived in rural Georgia, miles away from the nearest town. Our house sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by thick woods on almost every side. During the day, it was beautiful. The trees stretched for what seemed like forever, and there were fields behind our house where my sister and I would play until sunset. At night, though, it became a completely different place. Once the sun disappeared, the darkness outside was almost impossible to describe. There were no streetlights, no neighbors' porch lights, and barely any traffic. The only light came from the moon and whatever stars happened to break through the clouds. As a kid, I never really thought about how isolated we were. That changed one summer night. I don't remember exactly how old I was. Maybe 7 or 8. Young enough that staying up until midnight felt like an incredible achievement, but old enough to understand when something wasn't right. That evening had been completely normal. My parents had gone to bed around 10. My sister was asleep in our room down the hallway, and I had claimed my usual spot on the couch with a blanket and a bowl of popcorn. Nick at Night was on TV, playing old sitcom reruns that I barely paid attention to. I just liked the feeling of being awake while everyone else was asleep. Outside, the woods were perfectly still. Every now and then, I could hear insects chirping through the open living room window. But apart from that, the house was silent. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. The next thing I remember is waking up suddenly. Not the normal kind of waking up where you slowly open your eyes and stretch. It was instant. 1 second, I was asleep. The next, I was sitting straight up on the couch. Even now, years later, I can't explain what woke me. There wasn't a loud noise. There wasn't anyone calling my name. It was more like an instinct, a terrible feeling that something was wrong. For a few seconds, I just sat there trying to understand why my heart was racing. Then I looked toward the front window. Our living room window faced the woods. During the day, all you could see were trees and the dirt road that led away from our house. But that night, the moon was unusually bright. The silver light illuminated everything outside. And that's when I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There was a figure sitting in one of the trees near our front yard. I blinked several times, hoping the shape would disappear, but it didn't. Someone was up there. Even from inside the house, I could make out the outline of a person sitting among the branches, perfectly still. I froze. My brain couldn't understand what I was seeing. Who climbs a tree in the middle of the night? Who climbs a tree outside somebody else's house? For a moment, I wondered if maybe it was one of my cousins playing a prank. But that idea disappeared almost immediately. Nobody lived close enough to simply wander onto our property. And besides, whoever it was hadn't moved at all. Then our dog started barking. We had a big family dog that usually slept near the back door. The second he noticed movement outside, he jumped up and sprinted across the room. He slammed into the front window and began snarling. Not barking. Snarling. I'd never heard him make that sound before. The hair on his back stood up, and he threw himself against the glass again and again, growling into the darkness. That was enough for me. I jumped off the couch and ran down the hallway as fast as I could. I burst into my parents' bedroom, practically screaming. My mom sat up immediately. What happened? There's something terrifying about trying to explain something impossible when you're a child. I remember struggling to get the words out. There's someone outside. My dad was awake instantly. What do you mean, outside? There's a man in the tree. Even now, I can still hear how ridiculous those words sounded. For a second, neither of my parents moved. Then my dad threw the blankets aside and got out of bed. He grabbed something from the closet, I honestly don't remember what, and headed for the front door. The dog was still barking non-stop. My mom pulled me onto the bed and wrapped her arms around me while we listened. I could hear my dad opening the front door. The barking grew louder. Then silence. For what felt like forever, my mom and I sat there listening for something. Anything. A shout. Footsteps. The sound of someone running. But there was nothing. The house was completely silent. After several minutes, the front door opened again. My dad walked back into the bedroom looking annoyed more than anything else. "There's nobody out there," he said. I immediately started arguing. There was. I saw him. Dad shook his head. I checked the yard. Nobody's there. But the dog saw him too. He probably barked at an animal. Even as a kid, I knew my father didn't believe that explanation. Our dog had chased deer, raccoons, and coyotes before. He had never reacted like that. Still, after searching the property and finding nothing, there wasn't much else to do. My mom kissed my forehead and suggested that I sleep in my own room instead of the living room for the rest of the night. Normally, that would have upset me. That night, I agreed immediately. I practically ran down the hallway to my bedroom. My sister woke up as soon as I turned on the light. "What are you doing?" I climbed into bed and quickly explained everything. "There's somebody outside." She stared at me, half asleep. "What?" "I saw a man in the tree." She groaned and pulled the blanket over her head. Even then, I don't think she believed me. For the next hour, nobody in the house really slept. My dad stayed awake in the living room with a cup of coffee, occasionally walking through the house and checking the doors and windows. Every time I heard his footsteps in the hallway, I felt a little safer. Eventually, things calmed down. The dog stopped barking. The house grew quiet again. My sister fell back asleep beside me, and little by little, I started convincing myself that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Kids have active imaginations. Maybe I'd woken up from a dream. Maybe the shadows in the tree had looked like a person. Maybe the moonlight had played tricks on my eyes. Lying there in the darkness, I finally started to relax. I remember thinking, okay, Dad checked outside. Everything's fine. You can go back to sleep now. Then I looked toward the window. Our bedroom window faced the side yard, and there, standing outside, was the man. I didn't scream at first. I couldn't. My entire body locked up. The moonlight illuminated only part of his face, but I could clearly see that he was staring directly at me. To this day, I don't know how long he'd been standing there. 5 seconds? 5 minutes? Longer? I don't even know if he'd followed me from the tree or if he'd been there the entire time. What I remember most clearly is what he did next. Slowly, he raised one finger to his lips and made a shushing gesture. I can still see it perfectly. He wasn't angry. He wasn't smiling. He just stared into my room and silently told me to be quiet. Then, without a single word, he turned around and ran, not casually, not like someone walking away after a joke. He sprinted straight into the darkness, disappearing between the trees in seconds. That's when I finally screamed. I screamed so loudly that my sister shot upright in bed. My dad came running down the hallway. My mom was right behind him. I couldn't even explain what had happened. I just pointed toward the window and cried. Dad ran outside again with the dog, searching the yard, the driveway, and the woods around our house. He found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. But this time, even he looked shaken. The rest of the night is mostly a blur. I remember sitting in my parents' room while my dad paced through the house with his coffee. I remember my mom trying to calm me down while I cried so hard that I could barely breathe. Every creak in the house made me jump. Every gust of wind made me look toward the window. I don't think I slept at all. For weeks afterward, I refused to sleep in the living room again. Honestly, I barely wanted to sleep in my own room. Every night, I'd check the locks twice. I'd stare out the window before getting into bed. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and convince myself that someone was standing outside, watching. My parents tried to reassure me. My dad insisted that if someone had really been there, the dog would have chased them. My mom thought maybe I'd had a nightmare. My sister eventually stopped talking about it altogether. But deep down, I know what I saw. The silhouette in the tree, the dog snarling at the window, the figures standing outside my bedroom, and that quiet gesture. The thing that still scares me isn't the possibility that someone was trying to break into our house. It's the fact that whoever was outside knew exactly where I was. He had seen me in the living room. Then, later, he was standing outside my bedroom window. I've spent years trying to come up with logical explanations. Maybe it was a hunter who got lost. Maybe it was someone trespassing on our property. Maybe there was an explanation that a frightened child couldn't understand. But no explanation makes that night feel any less terrifying. Because sometimes, late at night, when I wake up suddenly for no reason at all, I still think about that instinctive feeling that pulled me out of sleep, that overwhelming certainty that something was wrong. And every now and then, when moonlight shines through my bedroom window, I remember opening my eyes and seeing a stranger outside, pressing a finger to his lips, silently asking me not to make a sound. A few summers ago, when I was still living with my parents, one of my friends and I decided to go for a bike ride late at night. It wasn't unusual for us. During the summer, We'd stay out until midnight or even later, riding around the city when the streets were empty and the air was finally cool enough to enjoy being outside. That night had been completely normal. We spent a few hours riding through downtown, stopping at convenience stores, talking about random things, and taking shortcuts through neighborhoods we'd known since we were kids. It was one of those nights that feels peaceful in a way that's hard to describe. The city wasn't asleep exactly, but it had slowed down. The noise of traffic had faded. Most of the lights in people's houses were off, and the only sounds came from distant cars and the occasional siren echoing somewhere far away. Around midnight, my friend and I split up to head home. He lived in the opposite direction, and my house was only a few blocks away. Normally, the ride back would have taken less than 5 minutes. I remember thinking how lucky I was that my house was so close. If I had known how that night was going to end, I probably would have stayed at my friend's place until morning. There was construction happening on the main road near my neighborhood, so instead of riding in the street, I had to use the sidewalk for the last part of the trip. It wasn't ideal, but there was almost no traffic, and at that hour, I wasn't expecting to run into anyone. For most of the ride, everything was completely quiet. Streetlights cast long shadows across the empty roads, and the summer air carried that familiar smell of hot pavement and freshly cut grass. I was tired, but in a good mood. I was already thinking about getting home, grabbing a drink, and going straight to bed. Then, just before I reached my street, I saw someone walking ahead of me. It was a man, probably in his 40s. He was alone, moving at a slow pace along the sidewalk. Even from behind, there was something slightly unusual about him, though I couldn't explain exactly what it was. He wasn't homeless. His clothes were old and a little messy, but they weren't dirty. He didn't seem drunk either. If I'd passed him during the day, I probably wouldn't have thought twice about it. Still, there was something about the way he walked that caught my attention. The sidewalk narrowed because of the construction barriers, leaving barely enough room for two people to pass each other comfortably. I didn't want to startle him by suddenly riding past in the middle of the night, especially when the streets were so quiet. So when I got a few feet behind him, I slowed down and called out, "Hey, behind you." The reaction I got was immediate. The man spun around and stared directly at me. I've replayed that moment in my head hundreds of times, and what sticks with me the most wasn't what he said, it was the expression on his face. Pure anger, not confusion, not surprise, just instant, intense rage. For a second, neither of us moved. The streetlight above us illuminated his face just enough for me to see his eyes locked onto mine. He looked furious, as if I'd personally insulted him. I gave an awkward little nod, expecting him to step aside so I could pass. Instead, he just kept staring. Something in my stomach tightened. Without saying anything else, I turned left onto my street. At first, I thought that was the end of it. Then I heard shouting behind me, "You fucking cunt." The words echoed through the empty street. I looked over my shoulder and saw the man following me. At first, he was walking quickly, but within seconds, he had almost broken into a run. "You think you're funny? I'll kill you. What the fuck is wrong with you?" His voice was loud enough to wake people up. My heart immediately started racing. Up until that point, I'd been annoyed and a little uncomfortable, but now I was genuinely scared. The worst part was that my house was only a few doors away. I could practically see it from where I was. For a split second, I considered riding straight into the driveway and running inside, but another thought hit me almost instantly. If I did that, he'd know exactly where I lived. The guy was obviously unstable, and the last thing I wanted was for him to know which house belonged to me. So instead of stopping, I kept pedaling. I rode straight past my house and continued down the block. Behind me, the man was still screaming. I couldn't understand half of what he was saying anymore. It was just a stream of curses and threats carried by the wind. The neighborhood suddenly felt completely different. 5 minutes earlier, the empty streets had felt peaceful. Now they felt deserted. Every house was dark. Every driveway was empty. Nobody was outside. I turned the corner and decided to circle the block, hoping the man would eventually give up and walk away. As I pedaled through the neighboring streets, my mind raced through different possibilities. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe he was having some kind of mental health crisis. Maybe he'd calm down after a few minutes and continue on his way. I remember trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. People yell crazy things all the time, right? Maybe I'd laugh about this tomorrow. Still, something didn't feel right. The anger in his voice had sounded too real. By the time I completed the loop and reached the entrance to my street again, the shouting had stopped. For a brief moment, I felt relieved. I slowed my bike and looked down the block, expecting to see that the man had disappeared. Instead, I froze. He was standing on my front porch. Even now, years later, I can still picture it perfectly. The streetlight across from my house cast enough light for me to see him clearly. He wasn't walking. He wasn't looking around. He was just standing there on my front steps, staring out toward the street as if he were waiting for someone. Waiting for me. I honestly can't explain the feeling that hit me in that moment. It wasn't just fear. It was confusion mixed with absolute panic. I had never ridden into my driveway. I had never stopped in front of my house. As far as I knew, there was no way he could possibly know where I lived. And yet there he was, standing on my porch, looking straight ahead. For a few seconds, my brain completely shut down. I stopped pedaling and simply stared at him. Then, almost as if he sensed me, he turned his head. Our eyes met. He saw me riding past, but this time he didn't yell. That was somehow even worse. The screaming had stopped completely. He simply watched me. No expression, no movement, just staring. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get as far away as possible. I gripped the handlebars and pedaled harder than I ever had before. I didn't look back again. Within minutes, I was back at my friend's house, banging on the door hard enough to wake his entire family. When he opened the door and saw my face, he immediately knew something was wrong. What happened? I practically pushed my way inside and started trying to explain between breaths. At first, he thought I was joking. Then he realized I was genuinely terrified. His parents came downstairs, confused and half asleep, while I explained everything that had happened. My friend's mom immediately offered to drive me home, but the idea of going back there made me feel sick. Instead, I texted my own mother. I remember sitting on my friend's couch, staring at my phone while waiting for her reply. It was after midnight, and I felt ridiculous sending a message that basically said, "Some stranger is standing on our porch threatening to kill me." A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. My mom called me instead of texting back. The first thing she asked was whether I was safe. I told her I was at my friend's house. Then she asked if I was sure the man was actually standing on our porch. "Yes," I said. There was a long pause. Finally, she told me to stay where I was for a while and said she'd check outside. Those 15 minutes felt like hours. Every possible scenario ran through my mind. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the man had simply stopped to tie his shoe near our house. Maybe there was some explanation I wasn't seeing. Eventually, my mom called back. The porch was empty. The street was empty too. Whoever the man was, he had disappeared. My friend offered to let me stay the night, but eventually my parents came to pick me up. Even riding in the back seat of our car, with all the doors locked, I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see the man standing somewhere in the darkness. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I left the house, I looked both ways before stepping outside. Every time I came home after dark, I scanned the street. Part of me felt embarrassed. It seemed crazy to think that some random stranger had somehow figured out where I lived within seconds. My parents debated whether they should call the police, but in the end, my mom decided not to. There wasn't much to report. A man had yelled at me in the street. He'd followed me for a block. And somehow, he'd ended up standing on our porch. It sounded strange even when I said it out loud. Life slowly returned to normal. At least, that's what I thought. 2 days later, I woke up to find that my bike was gone. We kept our bikes in the alley behind the house, chained up near the garage. Mine had disappeared overnight. At first, I assumed it was just a random theft. Bike theft wasn't exactly rare in our area. But then I remembered the man. The timing felt impossible to ignore. I stood in the alley staring at the empty space where my bike had been, replaying everything that had happened 2 nights earlier. The anger, the threats, the way he'd followed me, and, most disturbingly, the image of him standing on my front steps in complete silence. To this day, I have no proof that he stole my bike. Maybe it really was just a coincidence. Maybe some random thief happened to come through the alley that night. But I've never been able to convince myself of that. The thing that still bothers me the most isn't the stolen bike. It's the question that has stayed with me ever since. How did he know? I never stopped in front of my house. I never pointed toward it. I never even slowed down. Yet somehow, when I came back around the block, he was standing exactly where I lived. I've thought about every possible explanation. Maybe he guessed. Maybe he'd seen me leave the house earlier that night. Maybe he was just randomly standing there and I connected the dots because I was scared. But deep down, none of those explanations feel right. What frightens me most is how ordinary he looked. He wasn't some shadow hiding in an alley or some terrifying figure from a horror movie. He looked like a completely normal guy you'd pass on the sidewalk without remembering his face 5 minutes later. And maybe that's the reason the memory has stayed with me for so long. Because it happened in the middle of an ordinary summer night. Because it started with a simple "hey" behind you. And because sometimes the people who scare you the most aren't the ones who look dangerous. They're the ones who look completely normal until the moment they turn around and stare at you with a level of anger that makes your blood run cold. Even now, whenever I ride home late at night and see someone walking alone ahead of me, I slow down and cross the street if I can, because every time I hear the sound of bicycle tires rolling across an empty sidewalk after midnight, I can't help but remember that man standing silently on my front porch, waiting in the dark. The stories may be over, but some nights do not end when the video does. The people you heard tonight were not looking for fear. They were living normal lives until one moment changed the way they saw the world around them. Tell me in the comments which story stayed with you the longest. Subscribe to Nochtmire Witness for more true accounts from people who saw something they wish they could forget. Good night, and if you wake up suddenly, do not assume it was just a dream.